In today's episode of Convict Australia podcast, we have a very special guest, Stephen Gow. Now, Stephen Gow has written a book called From Distress to Deliverance, The Life and Times of William Gow, Convict, Schoolmaster, Farmer. Welcome, Stephen. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Jennifer. Pleasure.
Do you want to tell us a bit about your book? What inspired you to write the book?
Well, I've been interested in family history for a long time. I actually grew up in London, and that's quite interesting in terms of what I then discovered about William. But I grew up in London with Australian parents. I came back to Australia in the early 1980s, and through a family connection, I discovered that I was descended from this man called William Gow, but I knew nothing more about him. I went off to the Archives Office, which was then located in the Rocks in Sydney, and to my great surprise, because my parents knew nothing about this, I discovered that William was in fact a convict who had arrived in Sydney in 1817. So that was the beginning of the interest. And what really brought this book project to a head was the fact that the building that William is most closely associated with, which I'm sure we'll talk about shortly, in Wilberforce in New South Wales, was having its bicentenary last year in 2020. So the book project was born out of that event and a desire in the family to have some formal record about William Gow and his life.
Right, okay. So I love the title of your book, From Distress to Deliverance, because it's actually taken from something that William said, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. In the trial record at the Old Bailey, which is one of the first things I actually was able to get my hands on about William, and that's very detailed, there's a very lengthy trial record. The account of his arrest records him as saying, when he's discovered in this attic in St James's in London, "I'm in distress."
I thought that was really clever and nice way to introduce his story.
Yeah, he was only a young man at that point. He was still in his teens, and I think the enormity of what he'd let himself in for, which was basically housebreaking, and the knowledge that carried a death penalty, obviously that had a profound impact on him at that time, and those were his very words, apparently. So we thought that was a good title for the book, considering that he then made something of his life and obviously was able to be quite successful once he got to the colony.
So can you tell us a bit about his early life and the lead up to him committing a crime?
As I said, he was a teenager, probably about 18 years old when he was arrested. He was with a slightly older man called John Primrose, who was 25. Now, both of them, as it turned out, could read and write, so they were reasonably well educated, which was quite a rarity in Regency London, unless you were pretty wealthy. What we do know about them at that time is they probably were not particularly wealthy at all. In fact, the record that we have of both of them was that they were working as labourers. These were the years immediately after the cessation of the Napoleonic Wars in London, and there was a great deal of poverty. William's convict records suggest that he was born in Hampshire, which is a rural county to the southwest of London. So whether he had come from a rural regional background, farming background of some sort, and then come to London to try and make money, fallen into hard times, somehow he'd met up with this John Primrose, and they, on the night in question, they broke into a house in St James's. Not only did they break into a house, but they broke into the house of a peer of the realm, Lord Darlington. So that probably was a pretty heinous thing to do.
Yes.
If you were going to commit a house robbery, then going to a lordship's house would have been considered particularly bad, I suspect.
Yes, very risky.
So much so that it was reported in the Times the following day after their arrest on the front page of the Times. So if he'd had which we think he must have done because his handwriting was quite beautiful, copperplate handwriting, if he'd had a good education in his Hampshire upbringing, this would have been a source of great shame and distress, as he said, because potentially with those skills he could have gone on and made quite a good life for himself. England. But at that time, there was a great deal of poverty, as I say, and so, you know, the family might have fallen on hard times, and that's why he found himself in.
And what sentence did he receive?
Well, after the trial, he was, as was the statutory sentence for burglary, was death, and that's the sentence both he and John Primrose received. And after that, there was a process where there could be, if you like, an appeal. It wasn't a formal appeal process, but prisoners could basically seek clemency, and that was done by what was known as seeking the royal mercy, because all of these pardons, if you like, were issued by the then monarch, which was the Prince Regent, who later became George IV. And it's interesting because the records suggest that they were supported in their appeal by several persons. It doesn't name who those persons were, but they could have been, for example, perhaps ministers of religion or people who were respected people in the community, which suggests they may have had those connections.
And given him a good character reference.
Yes. You know, generally speaking, if people had a family or they were considered a good character, that was often sufficient to enable their death sentence to be commuted to transportation. And I think the feeling was there were so many death sentences being issued, and it was a time of some social unrest. A couple of years later, there was the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester, for example, where people were rising up against working conditions and difficult social conditions. So the government was quite keen that all the death penalties weren't actually carried out, because they would have probably been grounds for revolution, which they were very keen to avoid the French situation that occurred not that long before. So they were among a number of people who were given these reprieves, and that's how William came to be transported to Australia.
And what happened after the trial? Where did he go?
Well, for some months he was still holed up in Newgate Prison, which was a fearsome place, with a very bad reputation, and so much so that we know that just before he was eventually taken out of Newgate and taken down to the Thames to be put on a prison hulk, there was actually a riot in Newgate Prison, and William was one of the several hundred prisoners awaiting transportation to Australia that were caught up in this riot. We know he wasn't one of the instigators of it, because they were arrested and dealt with, but he was certainly there, and it was quite a violent episode, and only brought under control by the Lord Mayor of London, who refused to feed the prisoners until they gave up the culprits, if you like. But that riot was kicked off by an alleged theft of a watch from a visitor to the prison. And funnily enough, the people involved in that watch theft ended up coming out to New South Wales on the same ship as William Gow and John Primrose, and they were to reoccur in William's life later on. They were identities that he would meet where he was living in New South Wales.
And what ship did he end up coming over on?
Okay, so after he left Newgate, eventually he went and spent a couple of months at Sheerness on the prison hulks there, which were disused warships, and they were working there at Sheerness was a naval dockyard which was being developed at the time. So that was like, if you like, hard labour for those people, and the hulks weren't much better than Newgate probably in terms of the living conditions. But eventually, by December of 1817, the group of 175 prisoners, of which William and John were part, were ready to come to Australia, and they set sail on a ship called the Morley, which probably came and docked at Sheerness. Most of the prisoners on the Morley appear to have been on hulks at Sheerness at the time that ship set sail, which was quite an interesting time to set sail in the middle of the English winter, straight out of into the English Channel and through the Bay of Biscay. I suspect the conditions wouldn't have been particularly kind weather-wise. The Morley was a ship that's actually, in terms of its size, is smaller than a modern-day Manly ferry. So
I loved how you compared it to the Manly ferry. I grew up in the Northern Beaches, and I've caught that ferry many times. And it really gave me a sense of how small it was. I didn't really realise. I've read lots of these ship records, and for you to put it like that, I was like, wow, now I get it.
If you go through the heads on a rough day in one of those Manly ferries, you know how they get tossed around. So if you think about coming all of that way, that's quite an amazing voyage. But surprisingly, the Morley actually, at the time it arrived in Sydney in April 1817, it had the record then for the fastest journey from London, 113 days. Sorry, I think I might have said earlier, he set sail in December 1817. It was December 1816 that he set sail. Trial was in 1816, and he arrived in Sydney in April 1817.
And you've put a quote in the book, which I really like too, from Samuel Johnson, saying, being in a ship is being in jail with the chance of being drowned. And that's so true. I was talking about the Amphitrite in my first episode of Convict Australia, and just there were so many fears like that must have played in their mind, how easily things could go wrong and they could end up drowning on their way. So it wasn't just like, oh my goodness, I'm going into prison. I'm being sent to the other side of the world. Like, it's just fear upon fear,
I think, yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, for starters, going to Australia, although by this time, Sydney had been established for some years as a penal settlement, and no doubt, rumours had come back of what Australia was like, but still, they may as well have been going to the moon at that point in time, I think.
That's right.
Leaving all of their family and everything that was familiar behind. Then there was the risk of the journey. Surprisingly, there weren't that many shipwrecks amongst the convict ships, but sickness and illness was a serious problem. The Morley, as well as being a fast journey, that particular journey by the Morley was also a very safe one, and nobody lost their life during the journey. And William and John both had the benefit, if you like, of travelling at a time when the government had just recently introduced, on the recommendation of Governor Macquarie and his surgeon, William Redfern, they'd introduced the practice of having a surgeon on board every convict ship. So there was a medical person, and their surgeon was a young man called John Espy, who was a young Irishman who appears to have been a very skilled and able medical practitioner. Unfortunately, his journal of the journey didn't survive, but I found one of his subsequent journey, and the level of care that he was taking in terms of looking after the ship's company during the journey was quite evident. So that was a first piece of good fortune, and then secondly, the fact that the journey was a relatively quick one. They came via Cape Town. Some of the convict ships had to go via Rio and then right across the South Atlantic to get to South Africa before they came to Australia. So his journey was a fairly quick one.
And what did his indent say about his level of education? And did it say anything about his occupation? Was he, working as a schoolmaster before he came to Australia?
Well, a lot of people in my extended family feel that he must have done in terms of what happened to him when he arrived here. But the convict indent actually said both he and John Primrose were labourers. And indeed, that may have been what they were doing in London at the time of their arrest. They may have been itinerant labourers. They may have been looking for work, which is possibly why they turned to crime. And that is interesting for somebody that could read and write. You would have thought, when he arrived, he might have thought, well, if I can demonstrate my value in that way, I might be given an opportunity. But when he arrived, that was not what was recorded. It said he was a labourer. So his abilities in terms of reading and writing must have come out once he got into the colony.
So once he arrived here, the two of them, him and John, were sent to Windsor. What did they find? How was Windsor when they arrived?
Well, Windsor in 1817, in what would have been, I guess, the winter of 1817 when they arrived there, was a pretty desperate place. As you probably know, it was in its early days, it was the scene of some of the frontier wars between settlers and the indigenous peoples who lived that area. It was a pretty remote place up the Hawkesbury River, about a week's journey from Sydney by boat at that time. And then after settlement occurred, they built Windsor Road, and then by Macquarie's time, they built a toll road. So transportation was getting better. But in 1817, they just suffered a very severe flood, and there was actually a famine in essence when they arrived there. So although some extra labour might have well been useful in terms of recovering from that, in terms of feeding the population and the convict population, which included William and John Primrose, the local parish clerk, Joseph Harper, recorded in his journal that they were receiving bags of rice, basically to keep the population alive. So that they were being brought up the river simply as emergency rations to help feed people. So it was a pretty difficult place then, although it was an important settlement as far as Macquarie was concerned. Windsor was one of the first major inland towns that he wanted to establish in the Hawkesbury, and it was a fairly significant settlement just outside Sydney.
Yeah. So when did William become schoolmaster at Wilberforce?
So yes, remarkably, he arrived in Windsor in April 1817, not long after he'd arrived in Sydney. He went pretty much straight away to Windsor. In July 1818, so just over a year since he'd arrived as a convict, and normally convicts were assigned to work parties or some form of labour, he got appointed as a schoolmaster at Wilberforce in July 1818. So in that intervening period, we don't know exactly what he was doing, but my feeling is very strongly that he had made himself known to be a man who could, with some education, and that was a skill that was fairly rare among the convicts. And although it might seem surprising to readers today to think that such a person, having just been spared from a death sentence, would be appointed as a school teacher, that was by no means uncommon. You know, there were school teachers at Windsor and Richmond, the other major town in the Hawkesbury then, both of whom had formerly been convicts and were appointed as school teachers. So he got this lucky break. I think the church was heavily involved in public education at that time, so he must have come to the attention of the local ministry, and the Reverend Cartwright then was in the rectory at Windsor, and I think William eventually joined the Windsor Bible Society, and so I think he may have been a man of, if he wasn't originally, he may have, as a result of his experiences, become a man of faith, and that too would have probably helped his cause in being appointed as a school teacher.
Now, I've never been to Wilberforce, but it's still there today, isn't it?
Yes, you should go. It's quite a remarkable little town. It's just up the river from Windsor. It is a smaller settlement. It always was a smaller settlement than Windsor, but it is one of Macquarie's Hawkesbury towns. It's set on higher ground above the river, and the schoolhouse that is there, that was built in 1890 and 1820, is still there, and it celebrates its bicentenary last year. When William was appointed and arrived in Wilberforce, that building did not exist. It was probably in the very early stages of construction.
Right.
And we think there was a school there prior to that, but we think that was probably in a slab hut or something like that. And William wasn't the first teacher in Wilberforce. There was somebody there prior to him. Okay. But when William arrived and the new schoolhouse was built, which was a substantial two-storey building, he then remained in Wilberforce for 25 years, which is a considerable tenure in that post.
Yes. And can you tell me a bit about the layout? Because I believe he lived there as well. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So Macquarie built a number of these schoolhouses, and one had been built by Governor King at Windsor. Macquarie built another one at Richmond, which is no longer there, and the Windsor one is long gone as well. But the pattern that these buildings seem to follow was that the schoolmaster's residence was on the ground floor. So if you walk into the building today, you can still see a number of rooms of domestic proportions. And then there was a steep staircase which went to the upstairs, single upstairs room, which was the schoolroom, and also that served as the chapel or the church for the community on Sundays.
Wow,
the
so
building,
is the staircase inside the building or
yes,
outside?
no,
Inside.
inside,
Wow.
inside, and eventually in 1859, the Anglican Church built a sandstone, quite an attractive sandstone church next door, which is still there as well. But in those first 39, 40 years, this building, the schoolhouse, was the parish church as well. So that explains why after a few years there, Pitt Town and Wilberforce became a parish in its own right. And at that point, William became the parish clerk in addition to his school teaching duties. So we have some wonderful records of his writing in the parish registers of the day. But yeah, so the building was a multi-purpose building. It was a home for the schoolmaster and his family. And in fact, we know that of William and his wife's 10 children, 3 of them were actually born in those downstairs schoolroom rooms. Wow. Eventually, the family grew and he was doing well enough to build his own home elsewhere in Wilberforce. The upstairs, as I say, is the schoolroom, and you can still walk in there today and get a very good idea of exactly what a colonial schoolroom looked like. And it is now the only surviving Macquarie schoolhouse in Australia. So it's a
wow. I need to go out there and see it. And you've been there?
Oh yes, several times. In fact, when I first learned about William and discovered that he'd been a teacher, I was able to go out to Wilberforce in 1984, I think it was, and that for me was I don't know about you, but when you're doing family research and you find a place associated with an ancestor, whether it's where they came ashore or where they're buried or where they lived or whatever it was, but this building, I mean, it's a significant building, and to walk in there and to see the schoolhouse he taught in was, it was quite a...
It's an incredible feeling. Imagine to walk across, the floor and run your hand along the windowsill and think, he stood there. This is your ancestor. This is your family.
It's quite amazing. Yeah. And, there's some interesting stories in those days because it was the chapel. So the marriages and baptisms were carried out in that same room. One of the first people that William recorded as being married in the room was Solomon Wiseman, his second marriage, of Wiseman's Ferry fame. It's interesting that he was married in that building, even though he was Jewish, because I guess there wasn't many other options when you came to be married at that time. Yeah, so you sort of think not only of him, but all the other people that passed through there at the time, and they're recorded in the registers. And there's an interesting story in one of the accounts of Wilberforce about brides turning up in their long wedding gowns, having to navigate this. The original staircase was very steep. I gather it's been rebuilt in an L-shaped form now, but yeah, so they would have to actually get upstairs and then come back downstairs again after their wedding.
Wow.
It would have been quite interesting, different from the young school children jumping up there, I should imagine.
Oh, yes. And do you know if he was paid, like as a convict working there? Was he paid as a schoolmaster?
Yes, he was. The records show that initially he was paid a certain amount in money and a certain amount in rations. And then I think about in the early 1820s, they discontinued the practice of providing government rations to people like the school teachers, because the building, being also the church, came with what's called the glebe, or the church land that was associated with it. And we know there was a sort of allotment garden on that land as well. So I think by that time there was probably some livestock and they were growing their own crops there. So eventually William received for most of his term as school teacher £40 a year. And then he also received an additional amount of £2, 10 shillings and 8pence, I think it was, for being the parish clerk. Right. And his wife also worked in the schoolhouse as well. So their family income was over £50 a year, which was quite a significant amount of money.
Okay, and how did attitudes to education differ here than from London at the time?
Well, one of the things, I didn't know too much about this, but when I started researching for the book, obviously I went to try and see what the education system was in Regency England. And to my surprise, well, not total surprise, I guess, but what was interesting is there was no formal system of public education yet in place in the United Kingdom. It was very much means-based. So if you had money, there were private academies, you could send your children to school, but there was no system of public education, principally because life expectancy was much shorter and child labour was very much to the fore in terms of economic production. So children were used as a resource in the burgeoning factories of the Industrial Revolution, whereas in the colony, there was a very strong feeling from the colonial government and the government in Britain that it would not be desirable to have the children of a convict generation not educated. It was felt if they didn't educate them, then they would just repeat the sins of their fathers, if you like, and that they would end up with another generation of convicts.
Yeah, so, they wanted to break that cycle. Yeah,
absolutely. And this is where the church came in as well, in a very strong partnership with government, that the church was fundamental in setting up a system of public education before there was one in Britain. So it's quite an interesting social experiment, if you like, that they would bring in public education
so
between the ages of 5 and 12.
All right. So the children at Wilberforce, they were between the ages of 5 and 12. They were the children of convicts?
They were the children of convicts, but they were also the children of free settlers. It wasn't compulsory to go to school. And as I mentioned, child labour in Britain, that was still an issue in the Hawkesbury because, as I understand it, the family's first priority was their farming. And so children were needed at times of harvest, for example, or other times when they needed labour on the farm. That was their first priority. So they'd only be allowed to go to school if they weren't needed on the farm.
And was it a Monday to Friday kind of thing?
Yep. Yes, it was. And there was also a requirement to attend Sunday school. So for the children of the parish, this would have become a very familiar building that they were in very frequently. And while William was there teaching and his wife was there teaching needlecraft and so on, they would also receive regular visits from the local parish minister, who would be supervising what was happening at the school.
And both boys and girls attended?
That's right. In the first record we have, which was in 1820, Commissioner Bigg actually came and visited Wilberforce. He recorded that there were 38 pupils and 25 of those were girls, which is
wow.
Although the average over William's tenure was 60-40 male-female pupils. And
what sort of numbers are we talking about when the school first opened? Do you know how many kids attended, and did that increase over time?
Yes, it did, generally speaking. It fluctuated from a low of 18 in one annual return. They kept annual returns of what was happening at the schools. So the lowest number recorded was 18. The year that William finished, it was about 60 pupils, and the schoolroom's not that big. So with 60 pupils in there, it would have been pretty big place, I think.
So what sort of challenges do you think William faced as a schoolmaster?
Well, as a schoolmaster, he didn't, as far as we know, receive any formal education. He didn't go to teacher training college or anything like that. He pretty much arrived here, and it was obviously noticed that he could read and write very well, and that he obviously read the Bible. So the curriculum was pretty much reading, writing, arithmetic, and the Bible and the catechism. In terms of challenges, then, he didn't have any formal education. He may have, in that first year, he may have gone and sat in on classes at Windsor or at Richmond and observed what the other teachers were doing. Joseph Harper at Windsor was the teacher, and parish clerk, who actually was a very prominent figure at that time. He may have taken some guidance from him, or indeed the local minister, the Reverend Cartwright, but there was nothing formal. So he would have faced, I guess, a challenge. Well, if he did have some experience in Britain, he would have been very young. So it might have been his own experience as a student, possibly in a fairly basic rural school. Resources would have been another thing, with records of Macquarie writing back to England for books, slates, chalk, that sort of basic stuff that would be required to conduct lessons. I think the other thing I mentioned that attending school wasn't compulsory. So another challenge might have been the sort of intermittent attendance of pupils. And trying to have some sort of continuity in lessons must have been difficult, I should imagine.
And I imagine having that broad age range, how did he kind of work around that, do you think?
Yeah, so from what I can gather, and from most of the annual returns for all of the convict schools, or sorry, the colonial schools in New South Wales, they use something called the monitorial system that had been developed by an educationalist called Andrew Bell in India. And that relied upon the older pupils teaching the younger pupils. So the schoolmaster would teach the older pupils, who would in turn supervise and monitor the younger pupils in class. That system was developed in India, as I say, with much, much larger classes than William was experiencing in Wilberforce. So to that extent, he would have been able to keep a much closer eye on things, I suspect, than in the ultimate example of this system, which was played out in India. But that was basically the system that was used. And it's interesting, given that probably his primary dialogue would have been with the older pupils, is what happened with his marriage. I've got a theory about that too, which was quite interesting. So,
and speaking of his marriage, he was married to a convict?
No, he was married to a child of a convict, or the child of two convicts, actually. When he arrived in Wilberforce, so he arrived in 1818, as far as we know, his then wife would have been about 11. Her name was Maria Dunstan. She was the daughter of David Dunstan, a carpenter, and his wife had come out on the Second Fleet, Mary Mullender. She came on the infamous Lady Juliana, which you probably heard about, the all-female convict ship that took 6 months or more to get to Sydney and had all sorts of dramas getting here. So they were the parents. Maria was born into a family of a number of siblings, as was common, about 5 or 6 siblings. But she was 11 when William arrived in Wilberforce. And my theory is that she was quite possibly one of his pupils when he first arrived in Wilberforce, because she would have been in the final years of her schooling. And given what we've just discussed about the nature of teaching, you know, it's quite probable that he would have had quite a dialogue with her as one of the older pupils in class. So somewhat shockingly to our sensibilities today, William ended up marrying Maria when she was only 14 years old in 1821.
Wow.
At that time, the legal age of marriage was 12, so it was quite legitimate. And he had to get permission, though, because he was still an unpardoned convict at that point. He had to get permission from the governor to marry. So I might not have mentioned that being appointed as a teacher at Wilberforce, that was an appointment made by the governor, Macquarie. Now he was given permission to marry also by the governor as well.
And what kind of role did she have in the school once they were married? Did she continue?
I think it was a critical role. It wasn't mandatory, from what I can gather, but pretty much all of the colonial school teachers worked with their wives in harness in the school. So, you know, there was a significant number of female pupils. We know that Maria was paid £10 a year as a needlework teacher. You know, I think it would have been very much a partnership. So to the extent that they were there somewhat isolated in a small rural community, having a partner would have been a very important aspect of providing an education service that I suppose the community could feel was responsible and reliable and respectable.
He was probably encouraged to marry for his role.
I'd say so. So I have this feeling that she would have, when he first arrived, she would have been one of his pupils. I can't prove that. But certainly they had a long and, by all accounts, happy and successful partnership teaching at Wilberforce.
Now, during his many years at Wilberforce, Commissioner Bigg came to Australia. Did he comment on the education system or Wilberforce at all in his report.
Well, he did, and in fact, not only that, we know that he and Scott, his assistant, who later became an archdeacon in Australia, they actually visited the schoolhouse in 1820, and I suspect their eyes would have been on that because this was a building commissioned by and built by Macquarie only the previous year. Big, of course, was very concerned about what he saw as a sort of profligate approach to governance by Macquarie. He thought he was spending a lot of money, and not only that, that he was placing convicts in positions of responsibility. So when he arrived in Wilberforce in 1820, at the end of 1820, I suspect if William had heard anything about him and his commission, he would have been quite nervous. But all that's recorded in the report of the big commission in relation to Wilberforce is that there was a school there. It had 38 pupils on the day in question, 25 of whom were male and 13 were female. I think it might be the other way around, 25 female and 13 male. So that was all that was recorded. There wasn't any criticism by Big of the fact that they were being taught by a former convict. I don't know if he knew that, but that was certainly, he had a number of former convicts in his sights, of course, like Greenway and other people who'd risen to positions of some prominence under Macquarie.
Yes.
Maybe Wilberforce was too small a place for him to be too concerned about. But so I can only assume that William had kept a fairly low profile and behaved himself during the visit and didn't call any attention to himself. But and he, as I said, he went on to teach there for 25 years. So it wasn't picked out by Big as being, an unsuitable candidate to be teaching.
And what was his relationship to Macquarie? You've mentioned Macquarie many times, how he got his job and his marriage, and if you could tell us a bit about that.
I think it's a fascinating, William Gow's story is a fascinating example of Macquarie's philosophy in action, because as you know, Macquarie had this very unusual at the time, but very profound mission, if you like, to make a nation of this penal colony and to allow people, most of whom had been deported for fairly petty crimes. I mean, William Gow's crime with John Primrose was to steal goods to the value of £1. In fact, they were caught in the act, so they never actually stole anything. They were just caught in the process of doing that. So Macquarie had this emancipist philosophy that, these people had been discarded by their home nations, but what was necessary in New South Wales was to build a new country, not just have a glorified prison. So William arrived, he had these skills of reading and writing, and he was identified, brought to Macquarie's attention. So Macquarie appointed him to the job. He allowed him to marry, and the same year in 1821, he actually issued a conditional pardon to William Gow, which was fairly, as you may know, there were some so-called rules at the time that you had to serve, I think, at least 10 years before you'd even be considered for a conditional pardon. So William got his, within 4 years of his arrival, no doubt because he'd already hit the ground running with his teaching and was considered a very worthwhile, respectable teacher. So he got a pardon from Macquarie. So in all of those things, he benefited from Macquarie's governorship, which in a way that I suspect he wouldn't have done under other governors. We know when he came ashore in Sydney Cove on landing, as was common at the time, Macquarie inspected all of the, he conducted parades of all the incoming convicts, and he spoke to them about the opportunities they could enjoy in the colony if they were of good behaviour and applied themselves. So we know they met there. Just as Macquarie was entering the last few weeks of his governorship, he came up on a trip to the Hawkesbury with his successor, Brisbane, who was the next governor after Macquarie. They came to Wilberforce one morning on a horse ride, and I can't help but feel that Macquarie would have wanted to show him the major public building in town. So it's quite possible at the very end of Macquarie's tenure that William Gow would have met him again. We don't know that for certain, but there's this constant theme of interconnection between the two men's lives, which I find really quite interesting. But the thing that I think most surprised me, an amazing coincidence when I was researching the book. You've mentioned Commissioner Bigg, and his report had a lot to do with Macquarie going back to Britain under a big cloud, because it was felt that his policies had been far too liberal. And he went back to London. He was intending to retire back to his family estate on Mull in Scotland. Instead, he went to London to try and clear his name in Parliament. While he was in London, he was living in a lodging house in St James's in London. So I was researching that and looking at the details, and found the address of the lodging house that Macquarie had been living in. And this rang a bell with me, because I'd been in London a couple of years ago as part of the research for the book to go and look at the scene where William was arrested and committed this housebreaking incident, which was also in St James's in the centre of London. And sure enough, I discovered that the lodging house where Macquarie eventually dies in 1824 was literally right across the road from where William Gow had been arrested.
Wow.
I just thought that was an amazing coincidence. And also read that Macquarie's funeral cortege set off from that same spot, featuring all manner of people, including the Duke of Wellington. So that particular intersection between Duke Street and King Street in St James's is full of meaning for Macquarie researchers, but for our family, it's just another example of the way the two lives intersected in a very interesting way.
And after you mentioned his pardon, did he stop working at Wilberforce once he got his pardon? Was he like, yep, I'm out of here?
No, quite the opposite. He got a conditional pardon in 1821, and he kept teaching at Wilberforce through to 1842. So
he must have really loved this vocation.
I think so. I think it was a good living. There's no doubt about that. And he did at one point in the 1830s apply for a full, an absolute pardon. And I suspect that would have been granted. But as you know, one of the distinguishing features of an absolute pardon is it then entitled the holder to return to Britain.
Yes.
And while he set out in his request for an absolute pardon all of his achievements and the work that he'd done, he didn't say anything about wanting to go back to Britain. And so the request was declined, and there's a brief note on the back of the document saying cannot be complied with because there's been no reason shown why he wanted to return to England.
Right.
So it was almost as if, yes, we can give this man an absolute pardon, but because he doesn't want to go back to England, there's no need to.
Yeah, what's the point?
I suspect William had done that because he wanted to finally clear his name and his family's name from then on. But he never reapplied, and in 1842, it's said that he decided to retire to live on his means, which then led to a number of years in farming in the Hawkesbury.
So he ended up moving out of Wilberforce House for the next schoolmaster and moving to his farm with his family, who it was quite a big family, wasn't it?
Yes, he had 10 children, only one of whom died in childhood, which was pretty common in those days.
Yeah.
So, Maria had married, as I said, at 14, and I think by 15 she'd started having children, and so it was not atypical of the arrangements at that time. People had very large families, but by the time he retired in 1842, his oldest boys had started working in their own right, of course, and so initially the family started to farm, probably with the benefit of some of the younger children, both attending school and working on the farm as well. And eventually, we know that he was renting land. He didn't own land at what is today near McGrath's Hill, as then known as South Creek. He was farming land there, and one of his sons later owned quite a substantial farm. We don't know if that's the same bit of land, just near Mulgrave Station.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And whatever happened to his partner in crime, John Primrose? Was he as lucky as William?
Oh, he did really quite well for himself. Initially, he worked for the local magistrate and prominent builder in the Hawkesbury, William Cox. who owned land down near the showground and racecourse at Clarendon. Today's showground and racecourse. There was property there that William Cox owned. And John Primrose was a glazier and painter. We think he may have worked on, for example, St Matthew's Church in Windsor as one of the things that he did, because Cox was involved in building that. But he didn't get his conditional pardon came much later, which was more common after a considerable period of being one of Cox's employees.
Right.
But when he did get his pardon, he obviously had been quite responsible in terms of saving. He ended up buying a number of properties in Windsor and became a publican, a successful publican.
So the, little dabble in crime ended up, giving them a really great lives.
I think it's probably true to say for both of them that the lives that they were able to enjoy in colonial New South Wales were probably far more prosperous and respectable than if they'd stayed in difficult circumstances in London. I can't say that with certainty, but it's fascinating. John Primrose, as well as reading and writing, he could play music, and there's an entry in the records of St Matthew's Church that he was paid for playing sacred music in church, for example.
Wow.
So he became, a publican, yes, but a pillar of the community, and in the sense that when he eventually dies, he predeceases William by some years, but his grave, which is still in the front part of the churchyard at St Matthew's, is a very ornate one. And I think he did very well for himself and his large family.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for sharing your research. I really enjoyed reading your book, and particularly about the education system. I found this really fascinating. It's an area I'd like to look into more. How can people get a copy of your book?
Okay, so it's a self-published book, so it's not available in sort of mainstream bookstores, but the Hawkesbury Regional Museum in Windsor has copies in its bookshop. But if people would like to contact me, there's a email address which I think you're going to give out through the podcast.
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes. So if you want to get a copy of Stephen's book, just check out the show notes and there'll be his email address there, which you can contact him for a copy. It's a beautiful hardcover book I love all the glossy pictures that go along with the story, the quotes. You've put so much time and effort into this. Your family must be thrilled to have this.
Yes, it's been great. I've got a lot of positive feedback, and I'm glad you mentioned the illustrations, because that was my daughter's idea. She said, it's going to be a much more accessible book if it's got illustrations. And at the time, there's no picture of William Gow, unfortunately, much as we would all wish that they had been. And I thought, well, what am I going to do now? But, buildings and other characters that become part of the story, the ship that he sailed on. I've spent a lot of time trawling museums and galleries all over the world, in fact, to get the pictures of this book. And a lot of people have said that it has made it very accessible, because you get drawn in by the illustrations, and then you want to know more about the story. So
yeah, I love it. Well, thank you very much. We'll leave it there for today, but thank you so much for coming on the show.
Pleasure. Great to meet you.